Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, and a continuing series Castlevania Chronicles, where we review every single mainline Castlevania game in a retrospective fashion. And Dracula has found himself another dimension because we are in 3D for the first time with Castlevania 64 and its sequel/expansion, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. And I know most people don't like these games, but I genuinely think they are extremely good, and I'll explain why. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, that notification bell definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we have a Patreon link down below as well. But everyone was waiting back in the day for Castlevania to go 3D, because 3D was the hottest thing, and of course Castlevania was a massive franchise by this point in time. But when Castlevania 64 came out, it did not do well in review scores, but I bought it day one as a kid. I fell in love with it, and I've been in love with it ever since. I'm not going to say this game doesn't have problems, because it does, but what it's offering to you is so much better than the internet or reviews back in the day would lead you to believe. I do love the intro as these skeletons start popping up out of the ground. It does a really good job with environmental storytelling before we get to the actual castle itself. Although I will say that the grounds before you get to the castle go on for a pretty long time, and I think a lot of reviewers probably struck this game for it, because it takes a good half an hour or so until you get into that castle and start seeing things you are familiar with. But don't forget, this was back in the day when 3D was still basically being quote-unquote invented. Developers didn't have a great understanding of how everything worked, and they were experimenting with what was going on. But some experiments just work, and when these gates swing open and this skeleton that kind of runs around like an ape pops out, I fell in love with this as a kid, and I still love it to this day. And I think what happened on this game was that Symphony of the Night obviously came first, and that game was considered, and I still think it is, one of the best video games of all time. So taking Castlevania to 3D was going to be a large feat because Konami just released what was considered widely to be a 10 out of 10 game. But I do feel like Castlevania 64 takes the mantle of something like Symphony of the Night and runs with it as best as it can, because this is the open world Castlevania game, just like the PlayStation 1 version, except it is in full 3D. But those growing pains in 3D were always going to be hard to deal with, and you get a moon card there and a sun card as well. Time of day plays a huge component in how this game functions. But I love the environment that this game lives in. It is a very pretty game. What I'm doing here first is playing the original on emulation. I do own a cartridge, but then when we get to Legacy of Darkness, I'll be switching over to a direct capture from a Nintendo 64 and my cartridge I've owned for years, just to talk about the different stylings. Platforming in this game always gets knocked. It is not easy, but you need to understand what the game is asking of you. This isn't always just fast-paced action. You need to be methodical and slow with your jumps, or else you are going to fall to your death, and if you haven't saved in a while, it's going to set you back a long time. You just can't rush. You have to think about what you're doing, how you want to line it up, but if you just take even a couple extra seconds, you will be able to achieve probably 99 out of 100 jumps. If you fall, more often than not, it's because you were rushing. But I get that this was not what we were used to in a Castlevania game. You never had to slow down this much, and that's why this feels like a different style of the same franchise. It is a slower game. It has action, of course, and it's got some great boss fights that I'll show you shortly, but this is the type of game where you really need to stop and think about what you're doing and whether or not that's the right thing to do at that moment in time, and I do appreciate that. Now, I'm sure nostalgia is coloring a lot of my opinion of this game, because I could not play it enough when I got it. And honestly, still playing through it to this day, I absolutely love everything about it, even though I know it is flawed. I even appreciate that we're not playing as a Belmont clan member here. Reinhard Schneider is the heir to the Belmont vampire hunting dynasty, but he's his own character. But what this game does not do poorly whatsoever is the soundtrack. It is spectacular, so go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back and talk more about this game. I still can't believe the Nintendo 64 could have that good of a soundtrack, and that violin right there is absolutely incredible to me. But moving over to Legacy of Darkness, this is objectively the better game, but it is also in its own way a different type of game, and I recommend that if you're going to play one of these, you actually play both to understand how they change. And you will see that this is the direct capture from my Nintendo 64 cartridge with the expansion pack for the high resolution mode, and everything looks really nice. They got some decent boss fights in 3D, even though the developers at Konami were not that familiar with developing in the third dimension at this point in time. And that's just what it was like back in the day. If you did not grow up in the first generation of 3D consoles at home, a lot of games are just kind of cutting their teeth on the concept of what 3D even meant. But this is just another amazing title, and it is an expansion as well as the sequel to the same game. It's kind of hard to call this either or, and I almost thought about just talking about one game in this video, but considering that these kind of go hand in hand, I had to put both of them on. And you'll see here with the platforming, you can just, if you're patient, it will work for you. Even though I do die a few times and it feels slightly cheap, this game does not have the same level of cheapness that the internet would tell you, even if I just showed you that I did die. But I love the 3D open world nature of this game. It feels like the concept of Symphony of the Night, but taken into that 3D aspect. Even the boss fights, if they're smaller than something you see in Symphony, it doesn't mean they are not good. This was probably, to me, I think the most successful 3D Castlevania game, and we're going to be talking about the rest of the 3D games coming up. And I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments down below telling me that I am completely wrong about that. And that is fine. A lot of this retrospective is based on both history and fact as well as pure nostalgia. But you will see here in Legacy of Darkness, it is remixing that intro level from Castlevania 64, but it does different things with it. So that's why you can't really say, oh, I play Legacy of Darkness, I've seen it all. You definitely want to take a look at both of them, because even old Bonesy here is going to be slightly different in this version than they were in the original. So you have to play both of them to get the understanding of what's going on. And neither are very long games, so I bet you could beat both in a weekend if you had a guide next to you. But this is what I wish 3D Castlevania had stayed as, this open world Symphony of the Night concept where every area was interconnected and everything felt like one whole world to inhabit. Because as we get on to later 3D Castlevania games, it definitely scrawls back sort of that sense of open worldness and being able to go anywhere you want. And you'll see here as the castle drawbridge comes down, has anyone ever thought that maybe Dracula just shouldn't invite every vampire hunter into his castle? If somebody shows up at your house and says they're going to slay you, maybe just don't let them in. But outside of that joke, the soundtrack, great as well. Enjoy. I just love how epic this boss battle feels in this giant arena. It is massive, and you see down at the bottom you have boss view. The camera will change itself around to give you a better look at what's going on, and I do love the sense of scale. But if you didn't notice, the frame rate kind of dogs it on this one, and it's even lower in high resolution mode, even if it looks better on the capture. This is definitely not the type of game that is going to run in 60 frames a second, but it is the type of game that I wish Konami would remaster and re-release, although Konami these days is not interested in pretty much anything if it isn't Apache slot machine, so unfortunately the odds of seeing that probably less than 0. But again, it's just the sense of exploration and scale is what I love about this game. It feels as big as something like Symphony of the Night, it just happens to be in 3D, where the 3D games coming up feel much smaller in regards to how the overall world is. And I even love this little area here with all these blades swinging back and forth. It makes you stop, it makes you think, and it makes you realize that the pacing of this game is something you hadn't seen before in a Castlevania game. And I do think that's why a lot of people didn't love it when it first came out, because it is a completely different pace than you were used to. But the sense of scale, exploring the castle, unlocking new areas, feels identical to doing the same thing in Symphony of the Night. It just happens to be in full 3D. And this is just one mode out of 4 that are available in Legacy of Darkness, and you should at least play one of them, because this was just Castlevania stretching its legs into the third dimension and seeing what it could do with that overall formula. And like I said, I do not think this is a perfect game mechanically. The camera will fight you, the frame rate like you saw right there will tank, and you will take some cheap deaths. But from an ambition standpoint, bringing this beloved franchise into the third dimension, I think it succeeds, and I think it builds upon the foundation of Symphony of the Night to give us that exploration that we all know and love. This game is nowhere near as good as that one, but it is nowhere near as bad as people lead you to believe, and the story is relatively decent for what is on offer here. So don't believe what you read or hear when people say Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness are bad games. They are not. They are games that were made in the era when people didn't 100% know what they were supposed to be doing with 3D. And once Konami learned how to deal with 3D on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, I think they actually made worse games than the ones on the Nintendo 64. But yeah, leave me a comment down below and tell me I'm insane for saying these are great games. Otherwise, I'll be back with another episode in this series next week, and I'll have videos throughout the week. Let's go kill Dracula. Bye-bye.